Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Bridging Impact Podcast, the podcast that is passing wisdom to the next generation of youth sports parents and coaches. And I'm your host, Coach Furtado. In our episode today, we interview communications coach Betsy Butterick. She's worked with Division I, Division II, Division III, and WNBA teams on their communication skills. In this episode, she shares a lot of really great and impactful strategies that we can shift in terms of our communication so that we can impact our athletes on a greater level. We also share some different stories and opportunities for coaches to not only make an impact through their language, but also their verbal language, but also their body language. So without further ado, let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the Bridging Impact Podcast. Betsy, I'm thrilled for our conversation today as we hit restart on our start of our podcast. I'm really looking forward to just talking about communication because I feel like it's something that I try and strive every day to be better at as a coach. And I'm hoping to pass that wisdom on to the coaches and parents that are listening to this podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Justin. It's great to be here and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. So as we dive right in, the first question we ask all of our guests is, what is your definition of impactful leadership?
Impactful leadership for me is leadership that transfers ownership of knowledge. So I know that I've been an impactful leader if I've given away something that I have some knowledge about or some skill around to the point that the other person now feels like it's theirs and they can use it whenever it benefits them now and in the future.
Yeah, I love that because for you and a lot of, I know your work is through communication, and communication is obviously it affects teams in sports, but it's when players are done playing sports, like it will affect them their entire life. So transferring that knowledge on communication and all the nuts and bolts that go within it, I'm sure there's a lot that we can unpack there. I'd love for you, first, before we unpack all of that, to, share your story of how you became a communications coach.
Sure. I have a background in athletics and a degree in psychology, but I'm not a sports psychologist. I started playing sports when I was 3 with soccer, and I played all sports growing up and then played basketball and golf through college. And right when I got out of college, I started as an intern with Stanford women's basketball. I grew up in the Bay Area. I'd gone to camp as a camper, and then I'd worked Tara Vanderveer's basketball camp. And so she asked, would you like to intern with our program? And of course, the answer is yes. Like, what an amazing opportunity. So I started with Stanford. And then after that season, I went to the Seattle Storm and I worked on their staff under the late Ann Donovan. And then I got on at the University of Washington when they hired an all-new staff for women's basketball. And then after a year at Washington, I left Washington for Occidental College. Heidi Vanderveer, who is Tara Vanderveer's youngest sister, became the head coach at Oxy, asked me to join her on her staff. We were there together for 4 years. And then at UC San Diego, I was with Heidi for 3. She is still the head coach at UC San Diego. And I stepped off the court in 2015 to do what I'm doing now, which is working with athletic departments and teams as a coach and communications specialist. So my work is really divided between supporting coaches of all sports at all levels, whether they're an assistant coach, an associate head coach, a head coach, in developing the areas that they want to grow in order to give their best to the student athletes in their program. And then I also work with athletic departments and teams as a communication specialist, knowing that everything improves when we improve the quality of our communication. So if we're going to do the really hard thing, like try to win a championship, let's at least become more intentional about our communication so that we make the hard work easier to do, or at least we're more effective in the way that we communicate with each other.
Absolutely. So my first question would be, like, you've had a plethora and a wealth of experiences working and coaching under a lot of other great coaches. I'm curious, with communication, and I'm sure that each coach had their communication styles, but were there any common, like, running themes within each coach that you had an opportunity to work with that you felt was effective for, communicating with the team? Or do you feel like maybe each coach has their own communication style and maybe even each season is different?
I think the most effective coaches that I've worked with or observed, their communication style shifts or changes in response to the people on their roster. So every year we get new players on our roster and different people need different things. The trick is, how do you retain your authenticity or your integrity within
Right.
making those small shifts in your communication. And that's always I'll say the challenge, but also the opportunity is, how do I coach from a place of authenticity? How do I remain true to my integrity while also making adaptations in my language so that I can be most effective with the person that's in front of me?
100%. I'm curious, like, what do you mean by adaptations in language? I feel like I have an idea, but I'd love for you to, dive more into that.
Yeah. Part of what I love about communication is it is so varied and can be so nuanced. And I don't think there's a limit or ceiling to what we can learn about communication and communication styles. An example would be what one person on a team might find very motivating, something that a coach says, another person on that same team might find demotivating. So, for example, as a coach, I was someone who tended to remain a little more calm, but there were likely players on my roster that may have responded differently if I was really hyped or really passionate, right? In the same way that if you yell at a specific player, they might shut down and not respond, versus if you say the same thing in the same tone to another player, you might get a very different response. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about, shifts or changes in how we communicate based off of the person we're trying to connect with.
100%. So how is me as a coach, how do I develop, those relationships, but also how am I learning? What am I looking for and listening? Let's say like I yell at a certain player and they don't respond as well. Like, how do I kind of figure out, especially for me, like I'm starting a new team, a new season, I'm learning a lot of my players. Like, I don't know yet how all of them want to be communicated to, but yeah. I also understand that they are each individuals and need to be communicated differently too. So for those coaches that are, starting new seasons, like what's the best process to learning the different communication styles that work for our players?
A few different things, and it all starts with awareness. So being aware that you as one person are unlikely to hit the mark perfectly with every single person on your roster. And I think where coaches miss an opportunity is it's okay to say that. It's okay to say at your first team meeting, look, as your coach, my goal is to be as effective as possible in communicating with you so that you understand what needs to happen for individual growth, but also to achieve our team objectives. That said, there's likely going to be situations where it's not as effective as I want it to be or as you need it to be. And those are conversations that I would love to have with you. Another way you can go about it is if you do individual player meetings, let's say at the start of your season, to ask the question like, hey, think about coaches that you've had in the past. What's been most effective for you in terms of how you receive information? Or asking the question, how do you like to learn? Some people need to be shown. Some people want to watch before they try doing it themselves. Some people want to jump right into doing it themselves. Like I can only learn it if I actually do it. This is helpful for us to know when we're doing things like creating a practice plan or organizing drills. Like, how can we be efficient in organizing the people to put them in positions to be successful? So for me, the short answer to your question, Justin, would be have the conversation in whatever way feels appropriate given the context for your sport or the timeline that you have, while also making people aware that this is my intention. I may not always hit the mark, but when I miss, please have that conversation with me so we can continually get better together.
I think while we're on the topic of conversations and awareness, I think one of the biggest things that, can make or break a team is having those challenging conversations, right? Yep. There's conversations where, my intention as a coach doesn't meet the impact that it had on that it might, my intent for the impact, it had a different impact on a player and they took it the wrong way. And so right. I'm curious, in your experiences, how do coaches have some of those challenging conversations?
Yeah. And I'll say a lot of the work that I do is shortening the distance between intention and impact. Oftentimes with coach says something, they have this intention, unintended impact is negative or detrimental for the team. But this also happens between anybody, in relationships, in partnerships, in friendships, in family relationships. Between student athletes, it often happens as well, where, maybe you've got a team captain that has a very assertive, direct kind of communication style. Right. And you've got a newer member of the team who doesn't yet know that individual well enough to interpret the intention from exactly the way they experience that communication. So there's all these nuanced ways in which, with improved quality of relationships, with greater perspective, with higher quality information, we can start to be intentional about, okay, this is what I meant, and this is what you heard. And sometimes I've had coaches ask, tell me what you heard. When I said that, tell me what you heard. Sometimes they get the message repeated back to them verbatim. Sometimes they get the interpretation of that message. And now you've got better quality information on how to change the messaging to be more specific or land a little closer to the intention. One strategy that's been really helpful for folks, and this comes from the book Crucial Conversations. If you're listening and you want to be intentional about getting better at having those difficult conversations, 2 resources I love to recommend. One is Crucial Conversations. Get the 2nd edition. I believe that's the most up to date. The second is Fierce Conversations. They read very differently. Crucial Conversations is so well researched. I think it has 4 co-authors, over 30 years of research. Fierce Conversations is a little more relational. You're going to have poetry excerpts and song lyrics and different analogies, so it feels a little more, I'll say, warm in that way, while still being very supportive in how to have difficult conversations. One of the tools from Crucial Conversations is this idea of a contrasting statement. And a contrasting statement is a don't, comma, do statement. And you can use it in one of 2 ways, either before a conversation to avoid miscommunication, or when you notice a miscommunication has occurred, you can use it to clarify. An example would be, Justin, I don't want listeners to think that you asked me to be on the podcast because they are terrible communicators. I do want folks to understand that communication is complex because people are complex. And the more time we spend being intentional about our communication, the better chance we stand at connection. So it's a really subtle way to say, whatever it is you're worried the other person might think, that becomes the don't part. You name the thing, put it out there, and by naming it, thereby remove that as a barrier. You're saying, I don't want you to think this. And they're like, oh, well, that's kind of what I was thinking. So now you've created that connection, and then you follow it up with what you do intend and what you want them to understand. It's really effective. Very subtle, really effective.
Interesting. So I'm going to try and use this in a context of what I was practicing. So I'm going over, like, I'm teaching the freshman and sophomore team, right? And so at the time right now, we are, maybe doing a little more basic drills and fundamental drills. And I do have some players that are probably a little bit more advanced. So I could be like, one of the reasons we are doing this drill is because I want to go over the fundamentals of basketball. It's not to say that you don't know how to do this already, but it's something that I want to continue and have us master.
Good effort. Where there was a little hiccup was when you said the word but. So I don't want you to think that I think you don't know how to do this, but make that but an and. So it's either I don't, comma, I do, or I don't, period, I do. The but will throw people off. Being really concise and saying, look, I don't want you to think that my perception is you don't know how to do these drills. I do want us as a team to get really solid in the fundamentals so then we can start executing higher level skills.
Right. So it's a really little things, because honestly, that's a really good point. And I'm glad you brought that up, because everyone's like, oh, I know you're a really great player, but you do this, right? Like that's it's the biggest insult to injury. It's like, why did you even give me a compliment in the first place?
Exactly. And from my own personal experience, I mean, there's so many times where a coach said, hey, Betsy, I think you're doing a great job. It's like, yes. And then they say, but. It's like, no. So it's the same situation when a coach says, hey, Betsy, I think you're doing a great job. And then you're like, yes. And then they say, and I'm listening. I want to know how I can improve. Like, help me improve to help the team improve. I'm open to that feedback. Yet it does feel like a backhanded compliment. Or why did you bother even saying that? When people hear but, it's like what they just heard gets thrown out the window. So but contrasts two things. And sometimes we want that contrast. I'm always really clear when I talk with coaches or teams or administrators of the invitation here isn't to never say but. It's, can you listen and become more aware of the times when you do say but? And then can you look for opportunities to, instead of but, say and then recognize the difference that it makes in a conversation.
That's fascinating, actually. I mean, I knew that but always was that word, but I never had thought about like it as an and thing. I'm curious, what other like little like language tweaks do you find that, are simple and let me rephrase. What are some common language mistakes that we make that have some simple strategies that we can fix, like the but and the and?
Yeah. And you mentioned one right there. You said rephrase. And that's one of my favorite words, because one area where people are often less aware that they have a choice that could create a better outcome is their use of negatives. So our brain doesn't process negatives in the same way that we understand them when we speak them. And I wish I knew this when I was coaching basketball, because oftentimes, let's say end of a game, my team's up by 2, 3 seconds left on the clock. The other team needs to inbound, go the length of the floor and score in order to tie or win. Both teams are in the bonus. Any foul is going to be free throws. My team comes over, and I likely said something, Justin, like, okay, we're in a great position. The only thing we can't do is foul. Whatever you do, don't foul. And the team's like, yeah, don't foul, don't foul. And then we go back out, and the ref inbounds the ball. And within half a second, what happens?
They foul.
They foul. So subconsciously, a negative acts as a little blip on the radar, and we pay more attention to what comes next. And people have experienced this in their day-to-day life all the time. The thing you're trying not to do, like if I'm throwing a ball in an area like the house where I know I shouldn't be throwing a ball, and I think, oh, just don't hit and it's like guided missile right towards the thing that I was trying not to hit. Your brain doesn't process negatives in the same way that you understand them when you speak them. So it benefits us to rephrase in the positive. When you tell people what you want them to do instead of what you don't want them to do, you are much more likely to get the outcome you're looking for. So even small shifts like when we say, don't stop playing, rephrase that as keep playing. I always ask teams, I'll break them into groups and I'll say, okay, you've got 30 seconds in your group. I want you to write down all the negative phrases that you hear coaches or teammates say that start with don't or stop. And they get really excited and they write them down. 30 seconds in, I'll say, okay, pause. I want you to take those same phrases. And now I want you to rephrase them in the positive. Instead of saying what you don't want, how would you say what you do want? Right? So instead of like, I think about school and elementary schools, the rules are often posted on the wall and it's like, don't. Let's tell them what we want them to do. Instead of don't hit each other, it's keep your hands to yourself. Like these are small shifts that anybody can make. And that's one of the ways in which changing our language changes the environment, changes the experience, changes behavior in a way that better supports success.
That's really fascinating because I'm thinking about it like if that's probably the reason why, like if you say don't do this, that the person will obviously do it. And then the coach becomes frustrated because it's like, don't, I said don't, you know?
Yeah. I was really clear. You were. And our brains interpret it differently. I was working with a team recently. They just come back from their team retreat and they said, oh, it was really cool, Betsy. We went to this place with these caves and there were stalactites and stalagmites and there was a sign on the wall that said, do not touch the walls. And I just had to touch it. And I was like, well, there's a reason, right?
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So if I'm going to give it an example right now, like I have, for this one, player and specifically, they like to take 20 dribbles to get to the basket. And I know yesterday that I said it and a couple other coaches said, don't use, 20 dribbles to get to the basket. Instead, we should be using, you need to use three dribbles to get to the basket. Don't even mention that, X number, like give them that, what they need to be doing, or like with the foul example, right? Let's play good, clean defense, hands off, make sure we stay in front.
Keep your space, move your feet. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you can even, so there's avoiding the negative, right? And then there's also being explicit about what you want to say in the form of a command or a directive. And then there's the invitation to ask a question. With that individual who currently takes 20 dribbles, the demand or directive could be get there in 3, right? Or attack the basket, or whatever phraseology works really well for that individual. Another route to go would be inquiry of, can you get to the same spot in fewer dribbles? Or can you see, do you think you could get there in 3? Like you can make it kind of a challenge depending on the individual, right? Once they know it's possible, especially when you ask a question, we get a greater level of buy-in because they're telling you what you can expect instead of us just as coaches telling them what we expect. It's a different dynamic and it creates a different relationship.
No, that's really interesting. I actually have a follow-up question on inquiry because that's something that I've tried to make a big shift in. And I know we've talked about it previously here on the Bridging Impact podcast is instead of always talking at our players is asking questions. Like, can you get there in 3 dribbles instead of being like, I know you can get there in 3 dribbles.
Right. Yeah.
Kind of like, again, go back to your definition of ownership and kind of transferring that knowledge to them. Because when they articulate it, they start to own that, wisdom more.
Correct. Same thing when we debrief drills. It's really easy for us to stop a drill and say, okay, here's what's not going well. Here's what you need to change. Different thing if we ask the student athletes, what do you think is working well in this drill? And what do we want to do differently before we start up again? Same thing if you blow your whistle. And I like asking the question, what does your whistle mean? Like when you blow your whistle as a coach, is it always to make corrections? Is it sometimes for celebration or acknowledgement of what's going well? Like it matters. It matters. And it's often a tool that we use frequently, but we don't think about the unintended impact or the conditioning that's happening every time we blow our whistle. Because if I only ever blow my whistle to make corrections, every time I blow my whistle, you can watch it in the body language of your athletes right away. They're like, oh, here it comes, right? What did I do wrong now? Which, if that's what you want, okay. Are you aware that that's what you're doing? When you stop, it's very easy to make the correction. Again, basketball example. If I were to say, okay, when the defense or when the offense is here or when the ball's here, you need to be here defensively. Very simple, very common. Different scenario. If I say, when the ball's here, where do you need to be? Because now I'm getting better information. Do they understand where they're supposed to be? Anyone can go where you tell them to go, especially if you're visually pointing while you say it. But do they know? Because if they don't know, now I need to, that goes back to me as a coach of, okay, what didn't I communicate well, or what don't they understand that I can make more clear in order to support their ability to act in the way that I need them to support team success. So totally different interactions. When the ball's here, you need to be here. And especially with the context of time, as coaches, often, depending on the context, there's very limited time to get the information across. I have rarely met a coach in any sport that says, oh my gosh, I don't even know what to do in practice. We just have so much time, right? It's like, they're always like, oh, there's not enough time to do everything I want to do or get done today.
Right.
Part of that impacts the fact that we do give directives or commands or tell our athletes what to do much more so than we ask. And it's a stickier learning. It's a higher level of engagement, and it's a greater level of ownership when they tell us instead of us telling them. Now, they may tell us the wrong thing. That's a teachable moment, and that's okay. Simply asking not only allows them to be more, I'll say, proactive in their learning experience and to transfer that knowledge, it also engages their peers in a way that's different than if I'm simply talking to one person. If I'm telling Justin where he needs to go, that conversation doesn't apply to me. If I'm asking Justin where he needs to be, right away, their peers are thinking, oh, what would I say if coach asked me that question? It's different.
Yes, and so much of it is, honestly, I feel like for running an efficient and effective practice is making sure that we keep intact, make sure everyone is engaged the entire time. Because the more, as I've noticed, the more coach lectures throughout the time, I can start seeing heads start to kind of wander, right? And I think as coaches, we want them to be locked in and really focused. So I think that's a really good point. And so what do you think in terms of body language, for communication, and what I've seen different statistics on what percentage body language is, and how I know that one thing I have to get better at before the season starts is body language towards referees. And but I just feel like in general, like, when someone asks you about body language, where do you normally go?
I usually go to Hollywood and Steven Spielberg. There was a great story that I read once about how when Steven Spielberg was teaching film students, he would say, if you can turn the volume off on a movie and still perfectly understand what's happening in a scene, that's a really well-written script. So thinking about that as coaches, if I were being filmed on the sideline or in practice and somebody who wasn't present for practice didn't hear what I was saying, was observing, what would they think was happening in that practice? So it always starts with awareness for me of how can I become more aware and therefore more intentional about the message I'm sending when I'm not speaking. When I'm listening to an athlete ask a question, when I'm watching an athlete make a mistake, like the first 3 seconds after an athlete makes a mistake are very telling as far as what's going on for them internally or how quick their failure recovery is or isn't. And oftentimes we try to make a correction in that space where they're so internally critical, that voice is so loud, they can't hear us or be receptive at that time. So knowing body language as far as how are we showing up to our athletes, is my body language in harmony with the words that I'm saying? So am I sending one cohesive message where the words coming out of my mouth match my facial expressions, my body language, and they all share the same intention? Or are there things out of alignment? And then specifically, what am I saying when I'm not saying anything? What's the message that I'm putting out there?
That's good. What am I saying when I'm not saying anything? I think that's a good point. And I think that's something that I've had to think about too before, because sometimes, I can just, sit back and be a little bit more quiet, but then it's like, oh, coach, maybe it sends a signal, oh, coach doesn't care or whatnot. So trying to be kind of mindful around and intentional around, I think, our language and our body language. And so I'm curious, like through coaches you work with, what are some of the best ways to be intentional about language in terms of how to communicate certain messages or get certain messages across?
Yeah. It goes back to the general public speaking advice of know your audience. Coaches often ask me for the best way. And what I routinely say is there's no one best way. The best way is whatever is most effective given the context that you're in and the people that you're hoping to connect with. And that's not to skirt the answer and say, well, I'm not going to give you tools or I don't know the specifics. It's because it's true. Very rarely is there one most effective way for any individual to coach a team.
Of course.
I will say that being intentional about relationships, being intentional about letting your athletes know who you are, because in the absence of information, there will almost always be misinformation.
Yeah.
And as biological beings, we are primed to protect ourselves. So that's why we tend to think the worst case scenario thing when there's a gap in information. So if I, as an athlete, don't really know my coach as a person, then when something is a little bit off, I'm going to assume the worst instead of assuming the best. Because think about if there's someone you know well, and you've deemed this person to be a good human, and somebody comes to you and they're like, hey, this person said that. And right away you think like, well, that doesn't fit. Like, that's not who I know them to be. You're assuming positive intent versus if you didn't know that person, you got the same information, you'd be like, oh yeah, that sounds terrible. And now we're going down the path of confirmation bias of like taking a belief of somebody else and now looking only for confirmation of that judgment or characterization instead of information that points a different direction. So I would say for coaches, be intentional about allowing your athletes to get to know you within professional boundaries of who are you as a person so that they can assume the best if there's miscommunication. Miscommunication is going to happen. And I always say the biggest barrier or biggest challenge facing any team is never an opponent or an injury or even a pandemic. It's the conversations that we are or aren't willing to have with each other. And so often in the context of a team, we avoid the tough conversations for good intentions, for good reasons. I hear often like, well, I don't want to damage the relationship, or I'm worried coach might see me differently if I bring up this thing that's also really important to me. So the invitation is always, okay, how do we create shared understanding and an environment of psychological safety, of transparency, of openness? For you as a coach, when somebody brings you something that's hard to hear, what's your first response? Oftentimes, if this is a situation from the past, one of the first things a coach says is, why didn't you tell me sooner? When there's an opportunity there to say, thank you for telling me. This is hard to hear, but it's important to know. So can we lead with gratitude, and in doing so, make it more likely that we're going to get that important information sooner than if we simply pass the judgment and put them at fault for not coming forward earlier? You can feel however you want to feel. The words that you choose create a very different environment for the people that you're looking to support.
Right. And I actually have a couple of follow-up questions. First, I'll touch on the psychological safety aspect of it because I think that's imperative for all coaches. I haven't been around a ton of coaches so far, but I understand the power of words, and I can read body language, right? When a coach says something and it affects a player, I'm curious, in terms of our ability to communicate as coaches, parents, and leaders of youth is, what are some of the most important aspects of creating a psychologically safe space?
You have to make it safe to fail. Being intentional about, okay, what structure am I setting in practice? What are my reactions? What are my words? What are my judgments? What are my body language when there is a failure? Because one thing we know about coaching today's student athletes, when we're talking about Gen Z, they are disproportionately focused on external validation. And so they are also so fearful of their judgment by their peers. And so knowing that this is true, and in part it's because of the relationship with technology, the interaction with social media, like they've been conditioned over time to value the opinions of others in a way that's disproportionate to previous generations. As far as what can we do as leaders, as coaches, as parents, as educators, is being really conscious of, is this environment safe for them to fail? Where they can experience a failure without feeling like they are a failure. This is an important distinction. The language that we use, it's a very different thing if I were to say to someone, you're a selfish person, versus saying you made a selfish choice. So can I separate out the action from the individual and making a judgment on character? Thinking about not just can we make it safe to fail, but how am I validating the people and the voices in the space? Am I making space for all voices to be heard or considered? What judgments might I be making, even subconsciously, about certain individuals? And the question I like to ask coaches and also athletes, especially when they've interpreted something a certain way, is what are you making it mean? Like this thing happened, this objective thing, what are you making it mean? What's your interpretation of that situation? Are there alternative meanings that might also be possible? And if they were, how would that impact the relationship or the situation or the dynamic? So getting people to think differently than they may have before, but creating an environment where we intentionally allow people to show up as their whole selves and feel safe to do so. I mean, that's the thing that we really need to get into is if there's a perception that any individual athlete has to be a certain way in order to be safe and okay in our practice or playing environment, then it's likely we have not hit the mark of psychological safety. It's one of the things I encourage coaches to spend some time on if they're less familiar. Again, no judgment. If you don't know, that's okay. Now is a great time to start learning about the elements of psychological safety.
Yeah, no, that's really important. It's really important, I think, in that last point, just to make sure that everyone on the team needs to feel safe and respected and accepted for who they are. And, like, let's say a lot of times like, oh, you're not aggressive enough, right? Like, and then just constantly harping, you're not aggressive instead of like, you weren't aggressive on that play, or you should have pursued that rebound, and again, it's probably changing that language. And I feel like that's a big thing that I've always been trying to talk about in what you were previously talking about, is making it okay to fail. And just being like, especially for practice, it's okay to make mistakes, and also in games, right? Like even when I play pickup, like I've been playing for longer than most of my kids that I coach have been alive, but I still make mistakes. I still make bad decisions. And I try and relay that with them, that we are all human and that's okay.
Yeah. And even phrasing it, at the start of your practice with your team at the start of a season of, look, mistakes are part of the game. The goal here is never perfection. Because even if we played the perfect game, it's possible that we might not win.
Right.
Because maybe the other team also played a perfect game, and maybe uncontrollable factors like the officials or the referees or the weather or whatever it happens to be resulted in that team winning. So the goal isn't perfection. Mistakes are part of the game. The controllable aspect is, what can we learn from the mistakes that we make? How can we minimize mistakes to support success?
Exactly. And so I wanted to go back to a previous comment you made about, the importance of having your players get to know you in a professional sense. And I was just curious, like, what you meant by that and how coaches like myself can do that.
Yeah. And I say professional sense because oftentimes when I talk about allowing your players to get to know you, some people think oversharing, right? Like, oh, I'm going to talk about my personal life, or I'm going to talk about my relationships. And so I always put that kind of professional sense caveat on it, because I think there are absolutely ways to let people get to know you as a person without crossing into, oversharing or too much information or information that isn't relevant to their sport experience. One of the fastest ways is humility. And just showing your human side. Oftentimes as leaders, as coaches, as educators, as parents, we feel this responsibility to know and to demonstrate that we have it all figured out. Some of the more connective moments are when we don't know. And are you saying that as a coach? When an athlete asks a question, how often do you say to an athlete or to a parent or to a fellow coach, I don't know? Like, that's a great question. Let's explore that a little bit. Right. So showing your humility, showing your vulnerability, playing with them. And not everyone is in a physical condition to do that. I understand. So safety first, please be mindful of injuries or ability or whatever you need to do to be safe with them. But can you play with them as far as have fun with them? Can you joke around with them? Can you show them your sense of humor? Can you share with them a story that maybe relates to your sport about your past? But for a purpose. Like, I hear a lot of coaches talk about, well, when I was playing, and it's like, they don't really care. The missing piece is, how does the story about you playing provide value for their sport experience? Not just in terms of this is what I would do, but can you make the connection? Can you make it relevant and meaningful for them in this moment? If that's a story that connects, great. If it's not, maybe consider skipping that story.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point that you put it up in terms of just humility and connecting stories, because I think at first, when I heard you say that, I'm like, oh, should I share, oh, I'm doing this and then this in my life. And then you kind of put it into terms of context. It's like, no, just in general, just like show your humanness and show that you're not perfect, because I think a lot of times that is the biggest disconnect between coach and player is, right. And I think, I'm not sure if we talked about this in pre-pod call or if I talked about this with someone else, is that when players are expected to come in every single year and be better than they were last year. But coach shows up and he's the same every year and coaches the same style every year, right? Like having that humility to, have that conversation of, oh yeah, I am trying to get better and I don't know this, but I'm hoping that next year when you're coaching or, next week, I will know this, and just kind of sharing that human side of being a coach.
Yep. Yeah. Let them know what you're working on. We're asking them to grow in their skills. Part of our responsibility is to help them develop. I love using the 3 W's. So what are you working on? What are you worried about? And what's a recent win that you've had? And you can ask your team this at the start of a training session. And even let's say if you have a larger team and you're like, well, Betsy, I don't have time for them to answer all 3 questions. Ask the 3 questions and be specific. So what's one thing you're working on? One thing you're worried about, a recent win you've had, and then ask them to pick one, the answer of which they're comfortable sharing with the group. And then you do the same. So when they know what you're working on, like I'm working on managing the way that I interact with officials. Cool. Now they know you're human. And they're like, oh, like coach is working on their stuff too.
That makes a ton of sense. So with the 3 W's and time ticking on our clock right now, what would be your final piece of advice for coaches, educators, leaders, and parents to just take away on communication so that they can, obviously continue striving to be a better communicator, not only tomorrow, but next year as well?
I would offer that communication is a skill. And because it's something most of us do so much of every single day, we've stopped being as intentional about it as we could be. Any amount of intention is going to start to allow you to have the opportunity to improve the quality of your communication. And it's a self-reinforcing thing. With improved communication, we start to see better outcomes, better interactions in all areas of our life. And it's motivating and reinforcing to continue down that path. You don't need to listen to a TED Talk. You don't need to read a book. You don't need to do anything other than start to cultivate awareness about the kinds of conversations that you're having. What sorts of questions do you tend to ask? Do you tend to speak more than you listen in the average conversation? If you're looking for quick hits, you can go to YouTube. If you type in Betsy Butterick, there's 40 ACT videos. ACT stands for Active Communication Technique. These videos are 3 minutes or less, and they're designed to give anyone, not just those of us in sports, but anyone something that they can do today to start to improve the way that we communicate and connect with each other. If you're looking for something you can do in 3 minutes or less, I'd highly recommend going to YouTube. If in general you're like, I don't even have 3 minutes, simply start with awareness. If you can become more aware of the kind of communicator that you are, how you tend to communicate, you can also start to become curious about what's possible for you and bring greater intention to your communication.
Yeah, cultivating that awareness is really key, because I know that with some people, I'm better at asking questions than naturally listening. And I actually noticed the other day, there's, one of my friends is a little bit quieter. And I noticed, when I get together with a couple of other buddies, like we end up talking over him. So, luckily I had my girlfriend point that out to me. And so that's something I have to, continue to work on. I have to be kind of aware. I'm like, oh, wait, he's trying to talk and like, we're always talking over him. So like, it's kind of having that awareness that like in some groups, you may be a better listener. And then with some people, you're maybe more of a talker, and just always trying to, be better and strive and know that we're not perfect. So again, you shared your YouTube, but what are other ways that people can connect and reach out and, learn from your resources that you put out there?
Yeah, sure. If you just go to betsybutterick.com, all of my contact info, my social media info is there. So you can connect to Instagram, to LinkedIn, to Twitter. There's also a contact form if you have a specific question or are curious about something related to communication for yourself as a coach. You can reach out to me that way as well. My email is there too if you prefer to not use a form and send a direct email. So I would just direct folks to betsybutterick.com.
Thank you so much for your time and bridging your impact and wisdom on communication to our audience today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I got a full page of notes. I got the and, who's the audience, Hollywood, humility, 3 3 W's, so I'm going to have to prioritize the strategies I'll be working on right away. But thank you so much for your time today, Betsy.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Justin.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Bridging Impact Podcast. We'd love it if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment and a review on whatever platform you're on. It's the best way to help us grow. We appreciate you for doing that. We'll shout you out on social media. I'd also love if you connected with me on social media. Let me know your thoughts, and this is why I do it. I want to share knowledge and wisdom from experienced leaders to people like yourself and myself, so we can have this dialogue and move forward, make an impact on the world. So stay tuned, stay subscribed. Cheers.